And good evening. Welcome to the story behind the story of the American Merchant Marine veterans. We have a special guest this evening, which I'm quite sure that you'll be extremely interested in hearing many of the areas of the Merchant Marine. His name is Mr. Larry Brooks. He is president and chairman of the New England chapter of the American Merchant Marine Veterans. And so without further ado, I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome Mr. Larry Brooks. Larry?
Thank you, Jack.
You know, we were talking off camera, Larry, so let's take it from the top. I understand that in many areas of World War II, you have quite a bit of experience in Europe. So I wondered if you might kind of tell us a few little stories relative to that.
Well, Jack, I served on I made 7 trips across the Atlantic and the Mediterranean during World War II on Liberty ships and Army transport ships. And as you see on your sheet there, I have the combat bar, the North Atlantic War Zone bar, the Mediterranean War Zone bar, and of course a badge from the United Kingdom for the Battle of the Atlantic. And I don't know what else you'd want to hear from me, Jack, but what do you want?
Well, Larry, you know, the Merchant Marine, a lot of men have served both in the Atlantic and in the Pacific. Some men I have talked to relative were up on the Murmansk run. Mm-hmm. Others down the battle Normandy, Angelo Beachhead, into the Mediterranean. So when you're covering an area as you've covered, how long had you been out in the Atlantic during World War II on those ships?
Well, I served from 45 right through 1946. And all that time, I probably have about 6 months of sea time, maybe more. I don't know, Jack. It was a long time ago.
That's true, and it's like I had said before when we had done the prologue, the story behind the story of the Merchant Marine. This goes back to 1775, which is a long time ago.
Yeah, for my time.
But many men now that served aboard the vessels, both in the Atlantic and in the Pacific during World War II and Korea. Up from Korea to Desert Storm, Vietnam,
Serving
also
today.
Iraq, with the Military Sealift Command. And so today, as they did way back in 1775, they're still sailing.
Right.
Now I've got other questions I wanted to ask you about the American Merchant Marine veterans.
Well, let me tell you how this got started, Jack.
Please.
Back in the early 1980s, there were 3 different groups of retired World War II Merchant Marine mariners. There was a group in Phoenix, Arizona. There was a second group in San Pedro, California. And there was a third group in Fort Myers, Florida, which I got involved with. Eventually, through correspondence, these 3 groups got together and decided to form the American Merchant Marine Veterans. They met in 86, I'm sorry, Jack. They met in 86 in San Pedro, and they had their first convention. They formed the organization. They wrote up a constitution and bylaws through the help of people like Rex Farley, who was a Arizona state senator, and Bernie Myers out in the West Coast, and Leon Kalwara, who was at Fort Myers. Since that time, the organization has expanded into over 70 chapters throughout the United States. And we've held a national convention every year since. And the wife and I have been fortunate to have been able to go to 20 of those conventions, and we've met a great bunch of people across this country. And as far as we're concerned, it's a way for us to see the country, and really enjoyed it.
Well, I know, Larry, by what we have talked about off camera and what we're talking about right now, you have contributed a tremendous amount of effort and a tremendous amount of time in conventions, taking hold of the New England chapter, which covers New England, and there is an awful lot to it, especially the convention, some of the positions that you held at that time and the conventions you attended. I wondered if you might nail it on that.
Well, I first got involved with the conventions. I got involved with the Constitution and Bylaws Committee and was head of it for 2 or 3 years. Then, in 1992, I ran for the national office of the organization, and I held that position until 1995, having served 3 years. Prior to that, back in '85, I started what has become the New England chapter. And I did this by going around to the local newspapers, asking them if they would put something in their papers about what I was trying to accomplish. And as it worked out, I met a reporter down in Bourne, Massachusetts, whose uncle had spent 3 or 4 days on a life raft after his ship had been torpedoed. So I struck gold with him. So he took my picture, he wrote a nice article in the paper, and that's how it got started. I waited until I had 12 people call me that they were interested. I then went down to the Massachusetts Maritime Academy in Bourne, Massachusetts, and I made arrangements with them for meeting space. And we've been affiliated with them now ever since. And they've been treating us real well, and we've had a very good relation with the Mass Maritime Academy.
Now, I know that you meet on a monthly basis.
Right.
How long have you held the position of chairman and president of the New England chapter?
Okay. When I first started it, I was still spending my winters in Florida. So I didn't become the head of it at that point. But I've been head of it now for the last 10 years.
How do you find now, as you did 10 years ago, attendance? And I know that the unfortunate circumstances are that many of the merchant mariners have passed away. So how do you find your membership now in comparison to when you started?
Well, at one time, Jack, we had 210 members. And now we're about half of that. We're about 110 members. And as you say, we're a dying breed, I'm afraid of. But that's life. What are you going to do?
Well, that's very true. You know, it's very important because, as you may know, and perhaps a lot of people don't know, that the American Merchant Marine, by the act of Congress, is now a member of the United States Armed Forces. And consequently, a lot of the membership now, I understand, has the privileges that were never extended to them many years ago.
Well, that's true. We received our veteran status back in '87. Unfortunately, at that time, the funds for the GI Bill, as you know, everyone got after World War II, but not the Merchant Marine. So we got a watered down, if you use that expression, veterans status. We're entitled to a medical through the VA system. We're entitled to a flag on our coffin, and basically that's about it for now.
Do you feel, as time goes on, recognizing the fact of what you men had done in World War II and in Korea, do you think that they will enhance those privileges?
I would hope so. The thing that we have, and if you could see this, in 95, when they celebrated the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, they put out a fact sheet on the Merchant Marine. And I am going to give you a copy, or I did this afternoon. The very first paragraph of that fact sheet, the bottom line says, the Merchant Marine suffered a higher percentage of casualties than the combined military during World War II.
A staggering figure.
That's a staggering figure, Jack. It really is.
Do you know, I recall a speech that was given by FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, relative to the Merchant Marine.
Mm-hmm.
And he had stated in his presentation to Congress that without the Merchant Marine, we could tie up the ships.
Yeah.
There would be no oil, and there would be no provisioning.
Yeah.
And he held them in reverence because of what the men that at sea had done. I wanted to also ask you, I know that on merchant vessels, they had the armed guard.
Yeah.
Any areas that you may remember in accordance to that group of men, and they were members of the United States Navy,
Yeah.
that armed those ships?
Yeah. They're a great bunch of guys, and we've held conventions together. And I've been to 2 or 3 of their conventions. And we hold them in the highest regard, really. But getting back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, when he signed the GI Bill, he also stated that I hope now Congress will pass a similar bill for the Merchant Marine. And we had a Seamen's Rights Bill before the Congress. Unfortunately, Roosevelt, as you know, passed away. And just as a side joke, you may say, the joke in the Merchant Marine was that we forgot to tell Harry. So.
It was done, I know, unfortunately. I wanted to ask you, Larry, here it is, 2008. What are your aims, and what do you, as president and chairman of the New England chapter, want to do?
Well, we're going to try and, through your program, Jack, that you're putting together, get the word out, because most Americans do not know very little, or don't know anything, really, about the Merchant Marine. You talk to people today, and some of them are even amazed that it took us 45 years to get veteran status. And there's been programs on public TV and so forth that's told some of our story, but not all of it. We're going to try, through your program, to get the populace out there more educated in regards to the Merchant Marine. Because it's not only during war, but during peace, as you say, that we have to have this entity.
You know, it is so important, and I readily agree with what you've said, Larry, that the average individual, the merchant marine, this is like saying, well, what's that? And this goes back to the Revolutionary War. It recalls once again, as I had said before, what Thomas Jefferson had said, that the merchant marine is the lifeblood of this country.
Mm-hmm.
This was after the Louisiana Purchase.
Mm.
And so consequently, what we want to do is bring forth the stories behind the stories, beginning in episodes. Beginning in 1775, it's like a film, well, who supplied the three ships that fought, the Ranger with John Paul Jones, that had, those ships had to be supplied.
Yeah.
What did they do in the War of 1812? Was the merchant marine part of Jean Lafitte's program out of New Orleans? So there's many stories behind the stories.
Yeah.
And the average individual, they look at you and they don't know. And that's what we want to do, is bring forth in 11 episodes the story behind the story of the merchant marine. As no doubt, and the camera has caught what we call our prop, and many, many ships there. And we find that from there, it actually went into turbine, reciprocating on Liberty ships, turbines. It's advanced now into areas of very fast ships. A good expression of that was that, not recently, the United States Naval Institute and its magazine Proceedings had written an article about the merchant marine. Mm-hmm. So they focus on it. So what I feel that you want to contemplate, what we do, what else can possibly be done to enhance the membership and new members?
Well, right now, as we told you a little earlier, Jack, we're holding a mini convention. It's just being finished up this last weekend out in Reno. And it's the Western convention of our groups that are out there. And there's going to be presented through our communication officer down in Texas, Larry Kikow. He is going to try and make changes to our Constitution. Right now, in our Constitution and bylaws, you have to be a member of the Merchant Marine in World War II or in our allies of merchant seamen. He's going to try and open this up so that the organization can be a little more expanded as far as relatives and so on and so forth.
Like the Navy is.
Like the Navy League. It's
Yeah.
kind of a
Part of it.
feeling they want to accomplish. And so we'll see what happens. He's presenting the program at that convention, and it's over now, of course. And I expect Larry, I'll be hearing from Larry and when he gets back.
You know, what we want to do, I mean, just television-wise.
No.
Roger Hardy is more the back of this also, even though you don't see him on camera. Roger had taken the trips of the Murmansk run, and he's got stories behind the stories.
Oh, yeah.
And no doubt there is a lot of men that have their stories, and that's what we want to reach to.
Yeah.
To the actuality of the men that were in the Merchant Marine, that fought not only in the Atlantic, but also in the Pacific.
Right.
For in the Pacific, you could see the merchant ships. I could say at Tarawa, Anahuac, also off the canal, in some of those areas that I had seen them in Ulithi when they were forming the 7th Fleet. And so their stories and the Merchant Marine should be brought forth to let people know exactly what they contributed, such as what you have contributed and what you're doing now within the New England chapter.
Most of those, I was just reading an article recently, Jack, most of the merchant ships in the Pacific were destroyed by kamikaze pilots.
In Okinawa.
As you well know. The Japanese submarine fleet concentrated mostly on military Navy ships, and not like the Germans, whose
Well, anybody and everybody.
the Germans were smart in one respect. They knew from the beginning that the best way to defeat an enemy was to knock off his supplies. And this is where they put all the efforts in it. And they had made over 1,000 submarines. And they paid an awful price. I think about 75% of them got sunk and killed, and 75% of their people got killed. But that's where they concentrated their efforts, and that's why the Battle of the Atlantic took an awful beating.
It was. No question about it, because there was so many ships lost and so many men.
830.
Yeah.
Can you imagine 830 merchant ships if you put them in a row?
That would stretch quite a bit.
Yeah. And that's just American. That's not
Not
allies.
counting, and I know that England had their convoys are trying,
Yeah,
and they get blown out of the water.
yeah,
And some of the other ships also.
yeah.
So you see that the American Merchant Marine veterans, it's a very important entity today as it was yesterday.
Yes, right.
And what you've been telling me is very important. Now, what we're hoping to do, Larry, is to take a tour of the U.S. Maritime Academy at Buzzards Bay, where you hold your meeting,
Right.
and talk to the cadets, because when you go into the cadets, whether it be engine or whether it be deck, whatever it may be, they have a primed ambition to become a merchant mariner. There's been many books written. One particular that I had found very interesting is Down to the Sea in Ships. But I don't think that a lot of us that view this realize the importance today of the merchant marine and the necessity of the merchant marine during World War II.
Yeah.
And so consequently, that's why it's a privilege to have you sitting here and enlightening us as to the tomorrow. So what is in dire need, really, I find, is information, as you've given us in a short period of time, because a half hour is not long enough. So is there anything you might like to add before we close?
Well, I don't know, Jack. It's a funny situation. Let me just give you a little bit of background. When we came back from the war, and when it was over, the thing that hurt us the most was that people, like you say, didn't really know our part. And our part was the greatest kept secret of World War II. We have a picture, and I think you have a copy of it, put out by the Philadelphia Inquirer, I think was the newspaper. And it shows the Atlantic coast. And for every ship that was sunk out there, there's a little dot. And that coast is just covered with them. The Germans sunk, I believe, over 400 ships in the first year or so of the war off the New England coast. The government did not want the people in the United States to know this because they were afraid that they would panic. and they hushed it up, and then, as far as we're concerned, at the end of World War II, they just forgot about it. And they forgot about us, too.
The situation in history, Larry, it has been often said, you don't forget it,
No.
because without history and yesteryear, you don't have today.
Yeah.
Larry, I want to thank you very much for
Well, thank you, Jack, for your
the
time.
privilege of sitting here. There's something that I do want to read before we close the story behind the story. World War II civilian sailors served under the command of the armed forces and served in every invasion, given decorations and honors by Great Britain, Russia, France, Norway. They were prisoners of war of the Japanese and Germans, served side by side with the United States Naval Armed Guard, which Larry and I were talking about, which had one of the highest casualty rates of the U.S. Navy. They fought together and died together. So lest we forget, over 6,795 U.S. merchant mariners sleep at the bottom of the sea. Lest we forget. Larry, I want to take the privilege of thanking you.
Thank you, Jack.
It's been a privilege. This is Jack Peterson, wishing you and yours the very best. Good night.